Hey everyone, it's Jim
And Charles
from Valves & More, an online vintage tube store. And today, in Tube Lab number 210, we're going to try and answer the question, why aren't my vintage tubes working in my modern amp? 3 question marks. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. Well, first off, before I forget, we have some really nice tubes that came in, and of course we'll do show and tell at the very end of the episode, but we can give you some hints.
Yeah, well, we did last episode too. One big hint, they're rectifiers.
Yeah, so GZ34 is probably the single highest demand vintage tube that we can't find.
That's not much of a hint.
Okay, well, I tell it.
You gave it away.
I'm a straight shooter, though. I like to tell people the way it is. And you've got some other stuff, too, that's really exciting.
Yeah, okay, we'll keep that one secret.
Yeah. Well, can we give a hint?
Nope, none of your hints.
Power tubes? No. Anyways. Okay, so first off, most vintage tubes will work in most vintage or modern amps. Now, so why don't all vintage tubes work in all amps, even modern amps? Shouldn't a vintage tube always work in a brand new amp? The answer to that is no. Not all vintage tubes work properly in modern amps, and there's no single reason why. So let's run through a bunch of tube types that can have problems and explain why this is happening. Okay, Charles.
All right.
What's up first?
So we're going to start over here with some little 9-pin tubes, and these are both versions of the 6N1P. Now, the 6N1P is one of our favorite tubes. It's actually the main tube that we use in our new Rocket Modern Line preamp that's going to be coming out soon. And one of these is the standard version. Now, the labels are a bit hard to see. This is the standard one right here. And this is the EV version, so the extended ratings version of it. There, you can see the little rocket right there whenever I catch it with the light.
Now, there is essentially an equivalent that was manufactured or is manufactured in China
Called the 6N1. Yep.
Yes, and a lot of preamplifier circuits and amplifiers, particularly inexpensive amps coming out of China, use the 6N1.
Yep.
But the problem is you can't drop a standard Soviet-era 6N1P in as a direct equivalent.
Even though they are supposed to be direct equivalents, and again, this is not in everything. If they design the circuit correctly, they should both run just fine. But in our experience, we've heard this a lot. The standard 6N1P just doesn't work to replace a 6N1 in a lot of cases.
But the -EV, the higher spec version, will drop in and work just fine. And I found that out years ago. A gentleman who was a really good customer ran into this problem, and he said, "No worries, Jim. Can you send me the EV version and we'll try it?" And he did, and he said, "Yep, it works just fine." Now, why is that? Well, you're going to hear this fairly often today in today's lab. The many modern manufacturers are using modern tubes, as sort of their baseline tube to test their equipment, to design their equipment around. And they're not paying any respect at all to the original data sheets or the original tubes.
Even though they may be claiming that they match those specs, they often don't. So here's another good example right here. This is a Svetlana-made 5U4 rectifier. It's called the 5U3C here. That's just the Cyrillic, but it is a direct 5U4 equivalent, which is one of the more common rectifiers out there.
It's a beautifully made tube by Svetlana. And you would think that it would just drop into any Chinese amp that used the 5U4, but the problem with the Chinese amps, like with the 6N1 and 6N1P, is that they built them for their version of the tube that was essentially out of spec.
Yeah. And so while this would technically work on paper, and in many cases it still does, we had reports of these arcing in Chinese amplifiers, which is not a good thing.
Now, why would a rectifier arc? Well, it could be defective, it could be badly designed, it could be off-spec, or the amp manufacturer could be trying to reduce the noise floor of the amp to something more closer to what a solid-state amp would have as a noise floor.
And they put in too large of an inrush capacitor. And that's huge.
Or too much capacitance in total in the filter circuit. Filter circuits are, generally speaking, chokes, resistors, capacitors that basically take your raw sawtoothy DC voltage and clean it up to a nice smooth voltage.
Yeah.
We don't have enough time to put a scope on here for you, but I think we've done some episodes in the distant past.
Yeah. So how can you avoid running into issues like this whenever you're getting a modern amplifier? Well, do some research first of all. See if anybody is running vintage tubes or the vintage tubes you want to run in the amp, and check to see if they've had any issues with them, and that should tell you pretty quick.
Now, the first hint is when you look up the data sheet for the amp or the manual. Now, we do this fairly often for customers because people are new to the amp or new to tubes and they just don't know. So we'll look it up for them. And often we'll find that they don't actually tell you what the tubes are that the preamp or the power amp uses. Now, I know everybody's rolling their eyes and saying, that's not possible. And I'm going to tell you right now, yes, that happens a lot. You have to actually dig and do a forensic analysis of the literature that the actual manufacturer publishes to determine how many tubes, what the tubes are,
what versions, and sometimes you can't even figure that out without some trial and error with the amplifier itself. And these are a great example of them right here.
Well, let's keep going where I was leading. So. So that should be a big heads up. If the manufacturer doesn't upfront tell you what the tubes are, what the variations of the tube, for example, Charles was leading into that. Mm-hmm. With the 6SN7s, there are 3 primary variants and
probably like a dozen sub-variants of those ones.
That's right. So if the manufacturer doesn't do that up front for you, should be a real big warning sign, and I would run. Yeah. I would not buy an amplifier that does that. I mean, when we bring a kit amp to market, not only do we publish the complete specifications to it, we actually publish the complete schematics, and we list the tubes that you can use safely in the amp.
Tubes that we've actually tested in the amp.
Yeah, and that's probably the single biggest problem that's happening is that many modern tube amp manufacturers are not actually testing the real vintage tubes in their amp.
And the most common tube we see that happening with is the 6SN7. I mean, it is one of the most popular preamp tubes out there, also used as a driver, and in some very weird cases as a power tube. Don't ask.
Yeah.
But there's the GT version, the very early one.
And
the GTA.
GT just stands for glass tube.
Yep. And GTB. But many amp manuals you'll see just list 6SN7. With nothing else on there. No compatibility list, no definition on if vintage tubes work or not. And tubes like this one in particular, which is a rare early Sylvania. These were only made in one plant as far as I can tell, and not for very long. They don't survive well in a modern amp. Not at all.
And why don't they survive?
Well, they're rated for almost half the output power. They have lower voltage ratings, lower current ratings, and a modern amp that's pushing their tubes too hard will kill this in seconds. So, what do you want to put into those amps that you're not sure about? Well, you probably want at least a GTA, which is this beautiful chrome dome one right here, or a GTB to be perfectly safe. They should be as close as possible to a modern production tube as you can get in terms of specs.
Yeah. Now the key specs, the voltages, the operating point, plate dissipation. Plate dissipation is just a fancy way of saying how much power the tube can handle. The GTA and the GTB are are identical in those respects. The big difference between the GTA and B, besides the fact that the GTA was made way back in the 1950s and early 60s, and the GTB was made in the 1960s, 70s, up until the end of the second tube era, is the filament startup. And really, that doesn't apply to anybody that's running an amp with 2 or even 4 GTAs or GTBs.
Well, the filament modification was really meant for TVs and pieces of equipment that had what was called a series string heater, so that if you chained all the heaters together, you could essentially not have to have a filament supply of its own. And that was the big change from the GTA to the GTB in terms of specs.
And in fact, there were a couple of large changes that happened from the first tube era. That was the era of radio and telegraphy, into the era of television. So first we had tubes that were specifically designed as radio tubes, or as RCA will put in their manual, or receiving tubes, right? They're receiving a signal. And of course, they're amplifying it as well. And along came the Second World War, and that changed absolutely everything. There was a huge amount of tube development during the war that had to follow the technological developments like radar and all sorts of other things like, what do they call it, proximity fuses?
Yeah, proximity fuses. So that was one of Sylvania's big contributions to the war. They won a contract for making vacuum tubes for proximity fuses and making the fuses themselves. And these tubes were actually built in one of the secret factories that Sylvania was running that made those fuses.
And what did a proximity fuse do?
It was actually kind of like a very primitive radar on the tip of an anti-aircraft shell. So you would set it for a distance.
Are you serious? They shot this thing out of a gun?
They would shoot a thing out of the gun, and the tube would activate, and its whole purpose was to run for probably 20 seconds. And then it would detonate at the right distance.
Okay, so lots of development happened in the Second World War and the years that followed. And then along came black and white TV, and that just changed everything.
Yeah.
A lot of specific tubes were designed and made for TV. A lot of tubes had to shrink in size because the TVs just were filled with tubes. And of course, the screen you watched was a giant vacuum tube.
Yep.
And
cathode ray tube, CRT.
Yep. And then along came color TV, and technology changed hugely, because if black and white TVs had a lot of tubes in them, color TVs had a humongous number of tubes, and a lot of very specific tubes to the TV. And these days, and this is something I guess we should mention, if you're just getting into tubes and you're thinking, I need to get some tubes, and you see somebody in your area advertising thousands of tubes new in the box.
Or they've got an old repairman's case sitting around with a bunch of tube boxes in it.
What are the chances that 99% of the tubes are not useful in audio?
Very good.
Very good, because there'll be very specific tubes to mostly for color TVs.
Yeah.
Now, some of those tubes are reusable in audio circuits today, and we actually use a few of those tubes. But most of them they're essentially garbage because they're so specific in their tasks. So, I think the big takeaway with keeping an eye on your vintage tubes is see what the manufacturer says about the tubes. If they're really very good, if the manual is properly written, or the write-up on the website's really well written, they're going to tell you specifically what the tubes are, what the variant is or are that will work. We have come across manufacturers that will tell you, oh, you can use a 6SN7 GT.
No problem, yeah.
In fact, you can use any 6SN7 ever made.
Yeah.
And that's laughable, because we know right away now that the manufacturer has no idea what they're talking about. And that's pretty common. What we do with vintage tubes and what you do as hobbyists, it's a niche inside of a niche, as my brother-in-law likes to say. And if it wasn't for the World Wide Web, we would be a very small business indeed.
Yeah, well, and that's another good point. If the manufacturer hasn't filled out their manual correctly, if they don't have the information available, if they haven't done the actual work, check what other people have done. There's forums full of people rolling tubes that are willing to try anything and everything if they think it's going to work. They'll tell you if it will.
That's the first thing we do. When a customer gets in touch with us and says, I've got a problem with a tube, it doesn't happen that often. But when it does happen, and if it's a problem that we haven't come across before, that's what we do. We'll jump on the internet and we'll look to see if somebody's talked about a similar problem on a forum. And that'll help orient us as to whether this is a real problem or, sometimes tubes get damaged in shipping. It doesn't happen very often because, frankly, we're just so good at...
Very careful with packing.
We're very, very, very careful at packing. But that can happen as well. And, sometimes amps have mistakes in their construction and the tube just won't be at the right operating point. So there's lots of things. This is why when I started this conversation, I said there is no single one answer to what's going on.
Yeah, and we got one more tube to look at real quick here, and this is a vintage Svetlana 6550C, and we were lucky enough lately to find a number of these new old stock, enough to make some quads up and get them in the store, so they're still available if you guys are interested in these. But the reason why we bring this up is because it is the second version that Svetlana made. They made a B version of this originally that was horribly unreliable, and some of them are still floating around.
Thousands of them were made, and then they were withdrawn from the marketplace. And then 20 years later, they started filtering back onto the marketplace.
Yeah, so you have to watch for those, and you can tell right away because they're a Svetlana tube, and they have a side getter, and they have no chrome dome on the top here.
Now, the interesting thing about the 6550 is, if I remember correctly, Tung-sol invented the type, and kept sole manufacturing of, while they held the patents, very much like Mullard and Phillips like to do with their own designs, and those early 6550s were not that long-lived tubes.
No.
In fact, the only time I've ever been electrocuted while testing tubes was testing a big batch of vintage 6550s, and along comes Svetlana, who were and are a great tube manufacturer. They don't make tubes anymore, but the corporation itself is still a big electronics company, and they goofed it up. They got their what they thought was going to be a good generation. The 6550B was just an utter disaster, and then they fixed it.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, the 6550C is the best 6550 ever made. They're rock solid. We can bring in a large batch of good used tubes, and clear them, and we rarely see a lot of problems with them. And the new old stock tubes just have such a good lifespan, and that's not common with power tubes. Lifespan in power tubes, they just don't. A lot of power tubes just don't last that long.
They run hot, they run hard, especially in modern amplifiers, and they just don't last very long.
And here's a pro tip. If you come from a generation in which people would turn their solid state equipment on, turn their computers on, and leave them on their entire lifespan, this does not apply to tubes. Do not turn your amp on and just wander off and leave it running.
On forever, yeah.
No, I mean, even though we can pretty much install any tube we want in any one of our prototypes or any one of the kit amps that we have lying around in our music room, we specifically turn on to listen to a concert, and then we specifically turn off when the concert's over.
You don't need to wear down the filaments and the cathodes on them.
And if we're not sure if we're actually going to listen to some more music, we turn off. It's as simple as that, and that will preserve the lifespan of the tubes.
So another reason why we were showing the 6550 in particular is that the vintage version, the original tung-sol version, and the GE one that was made soon after, actually have slightly different ratings on them. So if you look at the two spec sheets for the modern tubes and the vintage tubes, they're very similar. At the standard operating points, they're identical. However, the modern ones can handle higher voltages on the plate, while the vintage ones can handle higher current. So, depending on the operating point, the vintage tubes may perform better, or the modern tubes may perform better, depending on what it was designed for.
That's a little weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a bit strange to see that happen.
And I think we should close out with one last thing. We're not going to bore you with data sheets, so don't worry.
Yep.
Though I was thinking we should. The data sheets for vintage tubes tend to be very accurate because these tubes were being used in aircraft. They were being used by militaries, by broadcasters. Broadcasters used a huge number of tubes, and not just little voltage twin triodes like 6SN7s.
Big transmitter tubes,
big
rectifiers.
In safe room broadcasting facilities, where you couldn't physically go in to work on the tubes until you actually turn the mains power off to the room. And I won't tell you a sad story because this is an upbeat channel. But yeah, so some serious bad shit can happen if people disregard the safety features.
Yep. Whenever you got kilovolts flying around.
Yeah, multiple kilovolts. But the thing I want to mention is that even though many modern tubes will have a data sheet, that data sheet is basically a copy in almost every case of the vintage data sheet, even though the tube will have a different specification. And sometimes the spec will be slightly lower. But as we were talking about, in many cases, these modern versions are actually higher spec variants that have not actually respected the data sheet. And in one sense, it's great that they're building better spec'd KT88s and 6550s and 5U4s. But on the other hand, if they're not disclosing it so that everybody understands who's building the amplifiers for them, then it becomes a big, big problem. And I think we're seeing this problem getting larger and larger as time goes on.
Yeah, especially with the search for more power out of things. Everybody seems to want more power. So
it's always been the way. When I was a budding audiophile way back in the 70s, that's the 1970s, so a long time ago, I grew up in high-end audio. Well, we didn't have high-end audio back then. We had cheap audio and we had good audio equipment. We were in what was called the receiver wars, and everybody was just going nuts for more and more power. And I think it topped out at 1,000 watts or something crazy like that. But yeah, so that's a big part of what's been going on with modern amps, is that they're chasing watts. And when you push a power tube to its very limit, and you use a tube that's built over spec as your sample to test your amplifier, then you can end up with a lot of problems in a hurry.
Okay, well, let's see if we can actually do this in one take here. This is the what came in section.
Well, I actually used to do one-take videos.
Yeah. Okay, so we had some great stuff come in. I'm going to leave these off to the side for a moment and take a look at sort of the bigger brother of the 6550 we were just looking at. We got in some absolutely beautiful original Svetlana KT88s.
So these are the vintage St. Petersburg production. You can tell by the rectangular holes in the plates.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully we're going to have enough to make up some quads. They just came in just an hour ago, so we haven't had a chance to test them yet.
But a lot of them came in.
A lot of them came in, yeah.
So, yeah, and they're a very high demand tube. If the Svetlana 6550C is the best 6550 ever made, in my opinion,
then the KT88 is probably the best KT88 ever made.
These are just wonderful sounding tubes. And they've, in my opinion, what makes them so great is that not only do they have the punch of the KT88 type and the bass is just fabulous, but they have a touch of warmth in the mid-range that's not common to most manufactured KT88s. Most of them sound really flat and lifeless. Not so with the Svetlanas. They had some of that magic sauce back then.
Yeah.
Okay, what else have you got, Charles?
Here comes some even more fun stuff. Oh, it's given away. Well, you gave it away earlier.
I did give it away.
GZ34.
Or 5A4R4, as it's also known as, in a Siemens box.
Yeah.
I don't think Siemens actually ever made this tube.
I don't think so either. Let's see what's actually in here. I wonder what that could be. Oh, there's a giveaway. There's two giveaways on the screen right now. We've got a sawtooth edge on the plate, and we've got some Phillips tube codes that start with a B. That can only mean one thing.
Blackburn, UK.
So these are rebranded Mullard GZ34s. And we were lucky enough to find a couple of new old stock ones. This is one of them right here. And just like the other tubes, we haven't tested them yet, although chances are they're going to test just fine. And we're going to get these in the store hopefully this weekend for you guys.
The bad news is they're very expensive.
Yeah.
And
we had to pay a lot for them.
yeah, and but we'll do our best price-wise on them. And they don't last. So if you didn't watch this video until Monday, well, they're probably going to be gone.
But these might still be here. Maybe. Depends if people are excited for them or not. And this is the same tube, but made by Matsushita. Now, Matsushita got a lot of their tooling from Mullard. And so this tube should actually be one of the equivalent to one of the last versions that Mullard ever made. And beautifully, it's still sealed.
Okay,
Still in its plastic.
We love opening unopened boxes.
Yeah, let's get that open.
I mean, I have a fairly large vinyl collection and tape collection, and I don't have, I think, a single record or tape that in which I haven't actually opened the boxes. If you're into keeping extra copies sealed, more power to you, but life's short. I like to listen to my records and my tubes.
Let's get that open. There we go. And
of course, we have to test these, so there's no way they can stay sealed in the box.
yeah. Oh, look at that.
That is a really interesting enclosure. I don't know if we've ever seen a Matsushita tube or any tube ever in a foam case.
Yeah, so that must be very late production. And let's take a look at the tube. And look at that. Got beautiful new production. Look how dark that gettering it is. That usually means that it has a very strong vacuum on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually one of our viewers pointed that out. He said one of the things manufacturers were striving for as the second tube era matured was to get harder and harder vacuums. And it just discolors the gettering. So it's not a sign of a defect. It's actually a sign of, I think, very efficient vacuum equipment.
Yeah, because whenever the gettering is going, it turns white. So you can probably think of it like the darker it is, the better.
Oh, and interesting, it's a seam top.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of the Matsushita tubes are seam tops, just like the Mullard versions, although this doesn't have the sawtooth plate, but there was a version of the Mullard 5AR4 that didn't have that sawtooth, but we do have the same mica structure, and these should be very good tubes.
Yeah.
So we're going to get those tested along with the Mullard version. They're not going to be quite as expensive, and hopefully we're going to be able to get some more of them in.
Well, if you stay to the very end, well, thanks for doing that, Charles. And if you stay to the very end, here's some discount codes to help you out. People have been grabbing this secret code that's not, I guess, not so secret anymore. It's costing us a lot of money, but that lets us know that you're either a returning customer or a viewer or really smart.
and that's who the codes are for.
And that's who the codes are for. And we can reach almost everybody around the world with flat rate $20 shipping. And if your order is $150 or more, after discount, the shipping's on us, folks. Stay safe, everyone. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.